As you can see, I'm technologically challenged. This is a graph of the U.S. the imprisonment rate in the United States, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it bears repeating. For more than 50 years, imprisonment rates in the United States from the 20s through the early 70s hovered around about 100 per 100,000. Beginning in 1973, imprisonment rates began increasing in the United States and increased with every year without exception until 1910. And since then, there have been some small decreases, but we continue to have an imprisonment rate of over 500 per 100,000, and when you include people who are incarcerated in our nation's jails, we now have about 1% of our adult population behind bars. This is a similar graph for the state of Illinois, and what you'll see here is that Illinois followed the national trend, and from the increase in the incarceration rate in Illinois started back in the 1970s, but these data show that from 1980 to 2000, it steadily increased every year, almost every year thereafter. And around in 2000, like many other states, incarceration rates flattened out, but continued to rise nationwide because the number of people incarcerated at the federal level was also increasing. So it's worth going back and seeing some recent commentary on incarceration in the United States. 10 years ago, Associate Justice Anthony Kennedy said, "Our resources are misspent, our punishments too severe, our sentences too long." 10 years later, Eric Holder said pretty much the same thing, telling us that we have too many people go to too many prisons for far too long for no good law enforcement. 250 years ago, Cesar Beccaria made the point that it is better to prevent crime than punish them. This is an admonition which, at least for the last 30 or 40 years, most of our policymakers have been ignoring. We now know that there are ways of preventing crime. You want me to so I can see this. Preventing crime so we don't have to punish them. We now know that early childhood development programs can be decisive in this regard. And an important person who's really been making this point is Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, but others have made it prior to Jim doing that. We also know that things like drug treatment programs can have the same effect, and reentry programs. But I'm here today not to talk about these kinds of issues. As Art pointed out, I've done a lot of work on early childhood development programs. But I want to address a more specific question of can we prevent both crime and imprisonment by better spending the resources that we commit to the criminal justice system? And currently, as a country, we spend over $230 billion a year in the criminal justice system. And there's an allocation of it. About $75 billion goes to corrections, and about $105 billion to policing, and the rest to the running of the courts. And so, in this talk, I want to talk tonight. I want to talk about the work I've done on the question of can we spend this money in a better way. And in fact, I wrote in 2009. I wrote an essay with Stephen Durloff, who's an economist at the University of Wisconsin, and the title of the essay was "Imprisonment and Crime Can Both Be Reduced." And our answer to that question was yes, they can be reduced, both be reduced. But it's going to require an abandoning of severity-based sanction policies in favor of policies making more effective use of police. And so in particular, we argue that there should be a shift in resources from corrections to policing, and in an era now of declining budgets for all things, including the running of the criminal justice system, that in this era, that the police should get a bigger share, of a smaller pie. So let me make just a couple of comments about imprisonment and crime prevention.
Raise the microphone closer to your mouth.
And Daniel, that microphone too, so stay over there.
I'll stay over there. Is about the different ways in which imprisonment can prevent crime, because it's central to some of the arguments that Stephen and I have advanced, and I've advanced since then on my own. One, it's important to draw a distinction between general deterrence, which is about the effect of the threat of punishment on crime, and what criminologists call specific deterrence. And this is an important distinction because what criminologists call specific deterrence is something that comes in the aftermath of the failure of general deterrence. Because it's about the impact of the experience of punishment on reoffending subsequently. And that can only happen if the person was initially not deterred. At the same time that Stephen and I wrote this essay on imprisonment and crime, I wrote another essay with Frank Cullen and Cheryl Johnson of the University of Cincinnati, in which we did a review of the evidence on specific deterrence, which we titled Imprisonment and Reoffending. And the conclusion of that review, which appeared in Crime and Justice, which Mike Conry's a protege of Norval edits, was first of all that the research on this question of how the experience of imprisonment on reoffending, that it was generally not of very good quality, but that nearly all of it has concluded that there's either no effect or a criminogenic effect of the effect of actually experiencing a punishment. And then this is, I think, an important quote from our essay, is that while we concluded that the evidence was not sufficiently firm to guide policy, it does call into question Wilde claims that imprisonment has some strong specific deterrent effect. That there's no evidence that the experience of imprisonment having a chastening effect on reoffending. And then finally, another way that imprisonment might affect reduced crime rate is through incapacitation. And I would argue that for the last 30 to 40 years, that our nation's policy of sending more and more people to prison and warehousing them there has been basically driven by this idea that somehow that we can reduce crime effectively by incapacitation. And it's important to draw a distinction between policies that are simply incapacitating people, locking them up and keeping them away from society, and there's an important difference between deterrence and incapacitation. Because crime control by incapacitation necessarily requires larger prison populations. You're reducing crime by sending ever more people to prison. Whereas crime control by deterrence offers the prospect of lower crime rates and lower imprisonment rates, because if crime is prevented by deterrence, then there is nobody to punish. And I just remind you to remember the admonition of Cesar Beccaria that it's better to prevent crime than punish them. So two key ideas that in fact go back also to Cesar Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham are concepts of deterrence, are the severity of punishment, and in the context of prison that means we're referring to sentence length, and also to the certainty of punishment, and in the context of imprisonment we're talking therefore about the probability of imprisonment. And there have been two types of studies of the effect of imprisonment on crime, which I've reviewed. One are regression-based studies that relate the imprisonment rate to the crime rate. and the other are policy evaluations of sentencing severity. As it turns out, is the first type of study has, to my mind, received far too much attention, and far less attention has been given to what the policy evaluation studies have shown on sentencing severity. This is, in the interest of time, I'm going to run past and talk. I'm not going to go off on why I think these studies of imprisonment rates and crime rates are not useful for answering are not helpful in answering any useful questions. Instead, I want to talk about studies of sentencing severity and what they concluded. And the studies of sentencing severity have addressed such questions as, does the California 3 strikes law deter crime? Does the threat of harsher penalties once you reach the age of majority, when juveniles go from being juveniles to adults, does that affect their offending rate? Do interventions like Project Exile, which threaten more severe penalties for weapon violence, do they deter? And then 70-era studies of gun sentence enhancements. And the conclusion, when you look at this literature, is as follows: is that at best they find modest deterrent effects, but they mostly find no apparent deterrent effect. And so the conclusion of this study is that increasing what we have the United States already has far longer sentences than any other country in the Western world, that increasing these sentences does not have any material deterrent effect. I'll just make a couple of important side comments on the issue of lengthy prison sentences and incapacitations. First of all, it's important for us to recognize, and I think people in this room know, that high-rate offenders are a very small fraction of the total offender population. And therefore, sentencing policies like we've had, which I think, for example, the California 3 strikes law is emblematic of, are very, very blunt and inefficient ways of trying to identify and isolate the small fraction of high-rate offenders. Another important point is that we know is that age is the best cure for crime. And what our sentencing policies have done over the last 30 years, which increasingly rely on sending more people to prison for very long times, is that we're turning our prisons into old age homes. So let me move now to another topic that's been part of this, the topic of police and deterrence, is that there is very good evidence that large changes in police numbers affect crime rates. That is, large downward reductions in police numbers presence result in increased crime, whereas large increases in police presence reduces crime. To me, this is not particularly surprising. An example of the latter is, just quickly, so you have a sense of the studies that have been done here, is that during high terror alerts, the number of police on the National Mall, are routinely doubled. And every time that happens, there's a big drop in crime rate on the mall and around it. But another important way in which the police can prevent crime is by the way they are mobilized and utilized. And so there's lots of evidence that concentrating police at hotspots, crime hotspots, reduces crime. That is one of the most important empirical regularities that Larry Sherman and colleagues identified more than 20 years ago, that even in high crime rate neighborhoods, the crime tends to be concentrated at a few small locations, like problem bars and so forth. And that by focusing police presence at those locations, you can prevent crime. And that then there have been various sorts of a variety of studies showing that what's sometimes called problem-oriented policing tactics can also be effective in reducing crime. And an example is a study that was done by my colleague at Carnegie Mellon, Jacqueline Cohen, and Jens Ulrich, who's at the University of Chicago now, that they did a study of problem-oriented policing in Pittsburgh, which was specifically designed to reduce gun violence in Pittsburgh, and they found that that mobilization was quite effective in Pittsburgh. So let me bring this back now to ideas from deterrence and talk a little bit about the ideas of certainty of punishment and deterrence. The conventional wisdom is that that certainty is a more effective deterrent than severity. An important caveat is that for that to be the case, there has to be some consequence that's associated with being caught and detected. But all the evidence shows that in the United States that we're well beyond the point of to make certainty work, that we have to make the severity of the consequences greater. As I said, this conclusion is consistent with research findings on the severity of deterrent effects, that there doesn't seem to be much of a severity effect. But it's important, now I want to make an important point, which ultimately relates to mandatory minimum sentencing, among others. Is it important to keep in mind that certainty is the product of a chain of events beginning with the apprehension and then ending in punishment. And that, getting back to my point about policing, that police are the first actors in this chain of events. So here's a graph showing that, just to make my point, is that somebody commits a crime, then there's apprehension, and P of A is the chances, the probability of being apprehended. Once you're apprehended, that there's a conviction that occurs, so there's a chance of conviction given apprehension. And then finally, if you're convicted, there's a chance of imprisonment given you're apprehended and convicted. And going back to this chain of events is that we have, as I described, good evidence that apprehension risk can deter crime. That is, the apprehension risk can commit crime. We have no evidence, actually there's no evidence out there on whether there's a deterrent effect of heightening conviction given apprehension. And finally, if we ask the question, is there a deterrent effect of imprisonment, of increasing imprisonment given apprehension and conviction, is the evidence simply doesn't support that increasing that risk, for example, via mandatory minimums, has a deterrent effect. And I think part of the problem, the reason is, particularly if you've once committed a serious crime, like a felony, the chances of imprisonment given conviction are already very high. And it's also very distant. And so, as I said, there's only good evidence of the deterrent effect of the certainty of apprehension. And there's no substantial evidence of the deterrent effect of mandating harsh sanctions post-apprehension. And thus, an important point in a recent essay, another crime and justice essay I wrote for Mike Connery, is that about the certainty principle, is that it is the certainty of apprehension, not the certainty of imprisonment, that is the effective deterrent.
I was just wondering, is there anything that's been done to look at maybe different crimes? Is this the same regardless of the type of crime?
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, is this independent of crime type? Which are you referring to the certainty of apprehension?
Yeah, each of those factors, you know.
Well,
whether it's a deterrent or not.
There's substantial evidence that the certainty of that police presence can reduce a wide variety of crimes, and particularly. And the issues the studies that have been done of the certainty of severity and punishment are the sorts that I listed before. So it's not like it's systematically gone across different crimes, but these studies of severity not deterring are been done over a pretty wide variety of contexts. Okay. So what the policy implications of this are is that criminal justice-oriented solutions to crime problems should focus on the question, how can the police, what can the police do to prevent crime from happening in the first place? And that putting more people in prison should be a last, not the first resort to crime control. And in my essay, the essay I described previously in Crime and Justice, I distinguish two roles of the police. One is their role as apprehension agents, and that's just catching people and arresting them and putting them in, moving them into the criminal justice system. And then another I describe as sentinels, and that the best evidence of deterrent effects of policing has to do with them operating in this so-called sentinel role. It's not to say that apprehension is not important, but it's important to keep in mind that when police apprehend or are in the mode of apprehending people, it's after deterrence has failed because they've committed a crime. And we want to stop them from committing a crime in the first place. And that finally, maybe some of the speakers who after this who are going to talk about policing, it's very important when police are operating in this sentinel role is that they respect the civil rights of citizens and do things and behave in a fashion that doesn't jeopardize police legitimacy. And I think that all we've seen happening in New York City over stop and frisk is, and the controversy that surrounds that is an object lesson in this final point. But let me stop here and let others.
Thank you. Well, that in layman's terms is the distillate, prevention not punishment, and we were privileged to hear it. We're going to have two very brief commentators on Professor Nagin's remarks. The first, as you see in the program, is John Mackey. He's the executive director of the John Howard Association, despite his relative youth. And if you look at our program, which is in front of you, our academy, this group of mixing academics and practitioners, police chiefs and probation officers and so on, we have a history involving the John Howard Association. If you look at 1958, at the list of past presidents, it includes Eugene Siemens. That's a famous name in penology. And then if you go down the list, in the 70s, there was 1972, one of our past presidents was Charles Kehoe, was Assistant Executive Director of the John Howard Association. The John Howard Association is a prison watchdog group. I believe they've been appointed by the federal court to monitor the Illinois prisons. And if you look at 1977, one of our past presidents was Michael Mahoney, who was also a director of the John Howard Association. So with that in mind, I'd like to present for a few brief comments on Professor Nagin's remarks, John Mackey, Executive Director of the John Howard Association.
Good evening, and thank you very much. I got the message to be brief, and I will be very, very brief. I guess, first of all, a quick amendment. So the John Howard Association is Illinois' only nonpartisan prison watchdog, but we have no mandate. It's purely an historical relationship, and one that is sustained through working with everybody, from correctional officers, administrators, members of the executive, legislators. And really, I think that is a limitation in some sense, because we can't make anyone do anything, but it's also a powerful source of our ability to affect change, because we have to talk to everybody, we have to work with everyone in the system. And I think in doing that, we're able to see things and learn things that are otherwise maybe hidden from view. I was going to say, you also, in your remarks, you left out one really important board member of John Howard, our former board member that Professor Nagin mentioned in his remarks, and that's Norval Morris. And Norval Morris is someone who I had never had the chance to meet, unfortunately. Of course, I read his work in law school, brothel boy. But especially this last year, as the city of Chicago pushed for mandatory minimum sentencing, I found myself increasingly going back to Norval Morris, not just for his insights, but I think his kind of moral vision of what the justice system should be. And I think that's the kind of thing that we lack today. Not just a sense of what we should do, what we shouldn't do, but why we shouldn't do it. And Norval Morris, I think that's where he always began, and that's where he always ended. And I think it's refreshing in a way that, again, I hope we can rediscover that moral clarity. And I guess I just have two brief comments, thinking about Professor Nagin's talks, and especially this last year, of where, again, the city of Chicago pushed so hard for mandatory minimum sentencing. From my perspective, a kind of vestige of the past that I think, as a country, we are moving away from. One is just how, which I'm continually struck by, how dominated our work is, the criminal justice work is, and the field, by kind of fantasy, magical thinking, driven by fantasies and magical thinking. And I don't say that to be critical or diminish the power of fantasy and magical thinking, because I think it's something we're all suspect to. When we're afraid, when we have problems we don't know how to solve, we resort to I think primitive fantasies that we, in our better moments, know are not true. But these fantasies have a grip on us. The fantasies like, a prison cell can make someone who's committed a crime a better citizen. Fantasies that if you increase penalties, you can cure crime. Again, these are powerful fantasies, and I wish they were true. We would never have crime if they were true. But the problem is when circumstances engage these fantasies, I think when as people we feel afraid, when we don't know the answer to problems like high rates of gun violence, they lock us into solutions that don't work. And unfortunately, and this pits reason against fear and other sorts of things. And unfortunately, the only way you can win that battle is through more reason. And this is the real value of people like Professor Nagin, and I would say in here people like Dave Olson, who arm advocacy, arm citizens with reason and rational arguments, people who would stand back from the politics of what's going on, that often drives this stuff as well, and they are able to say, this works, this doesn't work. And maybe here we don't fully know what's going on, but this is what we know. And I think the more we can rely upon rational argument through evidence, we're never going to have a perfect system. Such a system does not exist. That too is a fantasy. But we can have a better system, and certainly a more cost-effective system. And again, that's why I would say, someone I've been engaged for the last year on this mandatory minimum thing. I think it's not over, but it's taking a new direction. But the work of Professor Nagin and his colleagues were absolutely instrumental to informing the debate. And with that, I have another quick remark, and then I'll stop talking. So we talk about the role, so I feel like one of the frustrating things about the push for mandatory minimums in Chicago is that it comes on the heels of bringing in a superintendent of police who is supposed to bring these things to Chicago, right? This is Gary McCarthy, a man who I have a lot of respect for, who represents and is supposed to represent the very best of 21st century policing. And yet at the same time, we bring this person in to institute this 21st century policing, and we go back to the 1980s and kind of criminal sentencing. And that was very frustrating. But I feel like New York City, and the promise of New York City, and the kind of massive reductions we've seen in the use of jails and prisons in New York City and New York, that's the standard, right? That's what we're all looking for. And I remember talking to another criminologist not too long ago about this, Mark Kleinman from UCLA, when you probably know. And I was talking about this, and he said something that has stuck with me. Like I said, how do we get to New York City, Mark? How do you think? And he says, John, New York City's not so magical. That all they did was trade one form of correctional control for another. And I don't know what that means and what's preferable. But I think it's something we should all think about, as I think we're clearly wanting to move in the direction of New York City. And we should all think about what that means for our citizens and our police and our justice system. Thank you.
Being equally brief, our next speaker is a longtime member of the Academy. If again you look at your list of Academy presidents, a very long list taking 2 pages, you'll see the Academy was started in 1950 by Ernest Burgess and by a judge. Burgess was famous as the inventor of the Burgess concentric zone theory, which I studied in city planning, and I didn't realize until I just looked at it that he had also been the one to start our academy. He is famous for applying sociological techniques to the study of many urban problems, including crime. But you'll see the date we began was 1950. And our next commentator, our final commentator, joined the Academy in 1951. A year after it began. Art Bielik entered the Chicago Police Department, where he served in all ranks, including Director of Training under Superintendent O.W. Wilson. In 1962, Sheriff Ogilvie appointed Art to be the chief of the Cook County Sheriff's Police Department, and he turned what was notoriously a corrupt department at that time into an effective and model agency. He left policing to become an academic at the University of Illinois at Chicago and began the criminal justice department there. He is now serving as the executive vice president of the Chicago Crime Commission. Those of us in Chicago know how powerful that group is, of businessmen and others who are interested in improving criminal justice. So with that, I give you our second and final commentator, Art Bielik.
Good evening. I don't know many of you here because many of my colleagues have left us, and the number keeps getting smaller each year. But that doesn't diminish the Academy, which for almost a century has been the hallmark of good criminal justice and what it should be and how it should get there in this community. And you're emblematic of that, the group that's here tonight, and a great tribute to the current administration of the Academy, the numbers that we have, in addition to the preeminence of our speaker. I drove 2.5 hours to get here tonight just to hear him talk. I have the highest possible respect for the professor. Let me just limit my remarks to this sort of off to one side perspective. The city of Chicago is a crucible of crime and drugs that's different from much of what goes on in the United States. It has become an institution in Chicago, and it's difficult to say that publicly. Nobody wants to hear that it has. It's become a cultural phenomenon in the city of Chicago, and no one wants to hear that either. They want to pretend that crime is something that occurs and you call a policeman and he does something about it, and if they lag him, he goes into the criminal justice system, into felony review. God knows what's in that black hole. I haven't been able to find out in 50 years what's in that black hole of the felony review, but then it pops out again and he appears before a judge and he's sentenced to the penitentiary, and you saw what that looks like. So we have this very extraordinary situation in which there's a duality of criminal behavior, and it feeds on each of the two parts, and it goes around and around, and it never stops, and I don't think it can, because the side effect of it is the economics of the west and south side depend on this crime. You withdraw that, and you're going to have people standing on street corners as they do in the country, in the Balkan areas, and even now in places like Italy and Greece. People that are unemployed, people that have nothing to do but sit around and talk and think of how rotten the government is and what they could do about it. The reason that isn't happening is because we employ them. We employ them in this duality of criminality that we have here in the city of Chicago, where one hand is the drug organization, a magnificent organization. I work on it many hours a week. I met with DEA all day yesterday on it. It's terrifying in its immensity. Millions and millions and millions of dollars a year change hands on the west and south sides of Chicago in the drug industry. It's almost hard to imagine it. And then it goes back down to the cartels in South America, where the Crime Commission named El Chapo Guzman as the second public enemy #1 in the history of the city of Chicago, and probably the greatest influence on crime in Chicago right now. So we've got the drug industry over here on one side, and the drug organization providing drugs of all types to all kinds of people. And on the other side, we have the drug user, the addict, committing crime in order to have funds to purchase the drugs. And it goes around and around and around, and in my lifetime, it has never stopped. And I'm not sure what could be done to make it stop. So it's a very extraordinary situation as I see it, and it's somewhat different from where Wichita, Kansas, where O.W. Wilson came from. And I'd sit there at our conferences, and he'd tend his fingers, and he'd say to me, Arthur, the ever-present police car is the most effective preventer of crime. Just what you heard here tonight, O.W. was a pioneer in that field, and he believed in it, and it worked in Wichita. Now, when O.W. came here, he was trying to apply the same concept, and it didn't work, because the police car was always down. It was making an arrest. It was in the station. Because of the unions, it wasn't even there at all. The officers weren't there. They weren't there to man the cars. Right as we speak, about a fourth of the city's police cars do not have any policemen in them. They're sitting in the parking lot because there aren't sufficient officers to patrol all the beats in the city of Chicago. And I would hope that someday a superintendent would have the guts to say, well, then let's have fewer beats, and then he'd at least have the beats manned. But we sort of live in this world where everybody sort of hides their eyes, and the police cars are back behind the building, and the beats are empty. So O.W. found that there was a difficulty here, that he never had an ever-present police car, because the police car was always locking somebody up and was in the station where the officers were time off because of appearing in court. It's a very difficult problem. It's a problem I've looked at since 1951. It's very difficult to resolve it. I'm leaving it in your hands to tell us, to do the research, and I'm hoping that the institutions of criminal justice, the police, as I've written about many, many times, the continuum of police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections, that apparatus will listen to what you say and apply it.
Thank you.